Welcome to Species and Speciation. Today we're going to figure out what separates you from everything else in the world. And it turns out either a whole lot or not very much, depending on who you ask. We're going to go through a lot today, a whole lot today. 8 mini lectures. This first one is all about the origin of the species, which you've heard about. Who wrote The Origin of the Species? That's right, Charles Darwin. Turns out species have been a thing for a lot longer than Charles Darwin, a whole lot longer than Charles Darwin. So we're going to go through the historical significance of speciation. We're going to begin with what is a species. Now, the earliest human works literally were concerned with how do we classify things. Back way with Aristotle, we defined a species as an individual organism that represents a group of similar organisms. That is, it looks like a lion, so it's a lion. Today, we define a species as a group of related organisms. That was a weird way of saying that. Organisms. That maintains a distinctive set of attributes. So basically, it hasn't changed much in thousands of years. I'm going to take you way back to the beginning. How many of you guys have taken introductory philosophy? Like 2 people. Do you guys remember Plato? Did you discuss Plato? God, I hope you did, because Plato's Republic is one of the books that is basically required if you're going to be considered an educated person. There are a bunch of, in case you didn't know, there are a bunch of books that are considered essential reading for an educated person. The works of William Shakespeare, Plato's Republic, the Bible because of all the literary allusions in it. The list goes on. But this is a major sort of turning point book. In the Republic, Plato was coming up with the idea of how do we recognize each other? How do we recognize substance? So he came up with this idea of the form. That is, everything in the world, everything in the universe has this sort of perfect form that exists in our mind. We know this, check this out. Boom. What is this right here? It is a chair, right? We all agree this is a chair. Why is it a chair? Because you sit on it. So I sit on it, so this is a chair. That's how I defined a chair. Does that make sense? So far, so good? Okay, cool. So if I sit on this, is this table a chair? No, it's a table. But I'm sitting on it, so there's more to a chair than just sitting on it. What else makes that a chair? It's a designated seat and back? Oh, so it's got a bottom and a back to it. So now this is a chair and that's a table because this doesn't have that form to it, right? Cool. What if this chair was longer? Would it still be a chair? Then it's a bench. But it's still got all of our attributes that we wanted of back and bottom. So far, so good? All right, what if there was no back on it? Would it be a chair? Then it's a stool. Is a stool a type of chair? Maybe, maybe not. Then it was a bench a type of chair. What if the bench reclines backwards? Is it still a chair? Then it's a futon. You see what I'm saying? We can recognize this as a chair right away. There was no question about it. This is a chair. Because in our mind, we have a form of a chair, and we are comparing that chair to the form in our head. That's the way Plato thought. But you can see when you dig into it, it gets a little bit more tricky. You start to have variations of chairs. And then we can have a family tree of chairs. So Plato sort of laid the first groundwork for how do we define what's what. All right, so he then had a student named Aristotle. Aristotle's a jerk, in case anybody didn't tell you. But Aristotle came up with these words, and they were Greek words, not Latin words, genus and species, to refer to the generic and the specific category. Basically, he said, we can have a group of chairs, and within that group of chairs that all share this common characteristic of, I don't know, seat and back, you have variations, these specific things. Now, he wasn't concerned about chairs. He was concerned about the rest of everything. So he came up with this idea that you have substance, what we would call matter. And that substance then is subdivided into body and spirit. And then the bodies are divided into living and non-living. And then zooming in even further, living is divided into two categories, plant and animal. And then animals divided into man versus beast. So that's what Aristotle came up with. Aristotle was big on, yeah, people are special. There's people and then all the other living things. And that went on for a long, long time, well into the Victorian era. These early philosophers thought that a species, everything has a vital essence to them. And that essence is distinct and unchanging. What is this on the screen? Not trying to trick you. It's a lion. And how do you know it's a lion? Because your vital essence connects to its vital essence, and boom, you know it's a lion. This is the thought that used to happen. That's not what happens now. Does that make sense? You were literally, the philosophers believed that you recognized what something was because you could interpret its vital essence. Right along. So early taxonomists were heavily, heavily influenced by Aristotle. We're back to the body, spirit, living, non-living, animal, plant thing. We get down to animals, and we start breaking them up. We're like, let's start looking at their characteristics now. Some animals have red blood and some have no red blood. The ones that have red blood have hard bodies or soft bodies. Some soft-bodied ones have shells or no shells. These are very, very arbitrary distinctions. So for years, people tried to divide up the world based on arbitrary distinctions. And my arbitrary distinction might be different from your arbitrary distinction. So this led to a lot of fights. These are scientist fights. They hit each other with canes. We haven't gotten very far with taxonomy, but it's taken on a much more significant role in the modern age. And the reason for that is biotechnology. Sure, we can argue semantics and say, okay, that's a chair versus a couch. But what's coming into play now in the court system is we are able to design organisms and patent those organisms. So this is some of my work. I created glow-in-the-dark strawberries. To do that, I used a bacteria called Agrobacterium tumefaciens. Agrobacterium tumefaciens is a natural genetic engineer. If you were to stick new genes into it, it will infect the plant with those new genes. So far, so good? Because of that, it is highly valued for doing genetic modification to plants. Any plant that's produced using that bacteria, if it produces a profit, you have to give a percentage of those profits to the original person who found that bacteria. They patented it. Okay, so the big important thing that people were trying to do then is to create a new strain of bacteria. Because I don't want to, if I have a multi-billion-dollar plant that people are putting out in their fields, I don't want to share a percentage of that with this guy. I want it all for myself. So what do? You find a new bacteria. So how can you distinguish between, say, Agrobacteria tumefaciens and Agrobacteria rhizobium? The genomes are very, very close to each other. How different does this bacteria have to be in order for me to be able to patent it? Does that make sense? Basically, you're trying to make a knockoff that is just this side of legal. And that's where the definition of speciation is coming into play very, very heavily right now. People are trying to patent organisms, patent genes, patent enzymes, and the distinctions between each are minute. So that's what we're talking about today. We're getting into speciation. And you're going to see all the problems with speciation. Because trust me, I think there are a lot of problems with it. We can look at lots of different ways of identifying a unique species. We can look at their morphological traits. We can look, I have two rulers. We can look at their morphological traits, their reproductive isolation, molecular features, ecological factors, even their evolutionary relationships. I'm going to go through each of these. So first off, their morphology. You can tell a species apart because they look different. Behold, fish. We have different types of fish here. How would you separate these fish to begin with? Color. Some are reddish, some are yellow, some are blue. That's easy enough. How would you next subdivide them? Size. Some are big red, some are little red. These are morphological features, what they look like. Now, you originally divided them based on color, then on size. Would it be just as appropriate to distinguish them first by size and then subdivide by color? Yeah, and it will give you something totally different. You'll end up with entirely different classifications. So you need to figure out, as the scientist, which is more important, size or color. And that will be up to the individual to make their argument in their papers. So morphology, what does it look like? Here's another one. Reproductive isolation. You establish the nature based on the ability to interbreed. A horse and a donkey, when they mate, what do they produce? A mule. And a mule is sterile. So we can say a horse and a donkey can't mate and produce fertile offspring, so they are different species. That would be a reproductive isolation. Here is, I want to say this is a donkey and a zebra mating. Pretty sure. Which would create a mix that's high, it's inviable. It can't produce fertile offspring. This is one of my favorites. This is a crocoduck. The crocoduck, right? A duck mating with a crocodile. Can that happen? No. So the duck would be squashed. A duck cannot mate with a crocodile, thus they are reproductively isolated and separate species. Make sense? Reproductive isolation is one way to distinguish species. Morphology is another way. A third way is by their molecular features. Oh, now we're getting to my favorite, genetics, right? You can establish the nature of a population based on the percent change in genome between one population and the next. Okay, here's people. Here's chimp. Here's gorilla. And you'll notice that we have stupidly similar genomes. The big difference is just in this one chromosome. Now we can say, let's say we're 97% related to chimpanzees. We share 97% of our DNA. What percentage difference between us and another species makes us a unique species? Because there's about a 1% difference between each of us. 3% between us and a chimpanzee. So that means that what? If it's 3% off, then we're a different species. 10% off, 1% off, are we each our own species based on molecular data? And that comes down to, it's very arbitrary. Where's the line? Where's the cutoff? So molecular features are great for helping distinguish different organisms as species, but you've got to figure out what is that point where you say that's a new species, that's not. Ecological factors. You can establish what a species is based on where it lives. Where do they forage for food? Here we got some primates that live primarily on the ground, some that live primarily in trees. So they're arboreal. Are they different species because of the way they interact with their environment like this? Here's the classic example. When I'm cutting the grass, I have found, I don't know how many bees nests, yellow jacket nests underground. You're cutting the grass and then all of a sudden you get swarmed. Some yellow jackets live underground, apparently. Some live up in a tree. They look exactly the same. They can reproduce with each other. They don't, but they can. Are they different species? Don't know. Could be. There's an argument that they're different based on ecological factors. Argument that they're the same based on molecular features. And then you can start looking at evolutionary relationships. You can figure out, is that a species based on its relationship to organisms that have lived before it. You are human. We can all agree. All of us here are human, I hope. What makes us human is we all have common ancestors that were human. So your parents, probably human. You may not think that all the time, but let's say your parents are human. Were your grandparents human? Your great-grandparents human? Great-great-grandparents probably human. How far back do you go? At some point, there's going to be a distinct break. Let's not talk about people. People don't like talking about humans and their ancestors. Let's talk about chickens. Chicken and the egg, right? All right, so if we have a chicken lays an egg, the offspring is going to be a chicken. That chicken came from an egg that came from another chicken. Yes? Farther and farther and farther back in time we go, we start to see that there's some weird things popping up in chickens. Some chickens had teeth. Like, you guys know that? They've actually engineered that back into chickens now. Chickens can have teeth. No feathers. At some point, chickens were small dinosaurs. No feathers, reptiles, running around. At what point did they become a chicken versus some sort of early proto-bird? We don't know. It's arbitrary. Where's that line? So we've got problems with all of these. The way that you try to solve the problem with each individual one is you don't stick to only one way of defining a species. You look at all five. Morphology, evolutionary relationships, ecology, molecular features, I don't know, something else. What was that last one? Molecular features, morphology, reproductive isolation. Thank you. All right, so we get to the species. You can see why this is a big problem for Darwin. This is a big problem for everybody. So Darwin came up with that whole origin of the species idea. It was one way of discussing it, one way of describing it. Doesn't mean it's the only way.